I am 24 years old, and back in the spring of 2020, I was still living at home with my mom, my dad, and my two younger siblings. Right around March, which was exactly when the coronavirus pandemic started to get really serious, and everyone was being forced into quarantine, my parents bought a brand new house. It was a beautiful two-story property in a quiet neighborhood. Because of the sudden lockdown, we spent our first few weeks there entirely focused on the unpacking and settling in phase. It was a stressful time to move, but we tried to make the best of it. My bedroom was located in the basement. I actually did not mind this setup at all, because the basement was the farthest away from my parents' room, which gave me a lot of privacy. Technically, the room I slept in was just an extra utility room that was never really meant to be used as a bedroom, but we cleaned it up and made it work. Plus, my parents figured I would be moving out on my own pretty soon anyway, so they did not see any point in giving me one of the nicer, larger bedrooms upstairs. The basement in this new house was absolutely massive. It was a really cool space, and because my bedroom was down there, I felt like the entire basement was basically my own private apartment. But right off the bat, almost immediately after we moved in, weird things started happening inside my bedroom. Most of these strange occurrences happened late at night. I would lie in bed and hear strange scraping sounds coming from the walls. One night, I got up and knocked on the drywall, and it sounded completely hollow. There was a small metal air vent right above my bed. I figured a small animal was trapped inside. I turned on my iPhone flashlight to look through the slats, but the duct was too dark to see anything. I assumed it was normal house noises, but decided that if the sounds continued, I would ask my dad to look into it. To keep myself entertained during the quarantine, I set up my Xbox on the big TV in the main part of the basement. My dad had mounted a 50-inch screen down there, and I usually preferred to hang out in the open basement area rather than staying cooped up in my bedroom. One night, during our very first week in the house, I was playing Call of Duty Warzone. I was wearing my gaming headset, completely absorbed in the match, when I suddenly heard a very distinct, sharp sound. The noise came from the side of the basement where my bedroom was. It was muffled by the wall, which made me believe it had originated from inside my room. I quickly paused my game, took off my headset, and walked over to investigate. I pushed the door open, but the room was completely empty. Eager not to let my character die in the middle of the game, I hurried back to the TV. But as I sat down, I kept thinking about the sound. The best way to describe it was the sound of a heavy glass object, like a thick mug, being placed firmly onto a wooden table. I tried to convince myself that the sound had actually come from upstairs, and had just vibrated down through the floorboards. The very next night, I was deeply asleep when I was suddenly awakened by some weird, muffled thumping sounds. I lay there in the dark, trying to figure out if the noise was coming from directly above my ceiling or from the side of my room. I grabbed my phone, walked over to the air vent, and shone the light inside once again. Just like before, I saw absolutely nothing. I was starting to get genuinely worried that we had a major rodent infestation inside the walls, so the next morning, I brought it to my dad's attention. He told me to let him know if the sounds continued, and he suggested that I try to record them on my phone if I heard them again. A few nights later, I woke up at around 4 o'clock in the morning, feeling incredibly thirsty. I reached for the water bottle I always kept on my bedside table, but it was completely empty. I had no choice but to head upstairs to the kitchen to get a refill. After filling my bottle with cold water, I began my descent back down the dark basement stairs. Midway down the staircase, in the pitch black, I froze. I thought I heard a faint, rustling noise coming from the bottom of the steps. I paused and whispered, "Hello," thinking that maybe one of my younger siblings was hiding in the dark to scare me. There was no response. I pulled out my phone and turned on the flashlight, shining it down the remaining stairs to get some peace of mind. The basement was completely clear. I sighed, walked into my bedroom, and placed my water bottle on the small wooden ledge directly above my bed. But as I did, a sudden, overwhelming feeling of dread washed over me. My gut was screaming at me to look at the air vent in the wall one more time. I turned, lifted my phone, and flashed the light directly into the metal vent. It only lasted for a fraction of a second, but I saw it. Through the narrow metal slats, a pair of human eyes was staring directly back at me. They were wide, clear as day, reflecting the bright light of my phone. The moment the light hit them, The eyes quickly vanished backward into the dark void behind the wall. I did not look closer. I screamed, dropped my phone, and bolted out of the room, running up the stairs to find my dad. My family came downstairs, and I pointed at the vent. My dad took a look inside with a flashlight, but there was nothing there. My parents tried to convince me that I was just exhausted, seeing things because of a lack of sleep, and letting my imagination run wild. I did not believe them for a second. I refused to sleep in the basement that night. I grabbed a blanket, slept on the living room couch upstairs, and made sure the basement door was locked. The basement door only had a lock because of an outdoor entrance. The next afternoon, I went back down to grab some of my things and made a shocking discovery. On the far wall, a small wood panel was sitting slightly open. I called my dad downstairs, and together we pulled the panel back. It revealed a tiny hidden crawl space. On the dusty floor lay a blanket and a small wooden stool. We followed a narrow, dark corridor that stretched along the side of the house. At the very end, we found ourselves staring directly through the back of the air vent and into my bedroom. The realization hit us like a tidal wave. A stranger had been living inside our walls. They had been sneaking out at night to steal food from our kitchen, and they had been sitting on that stool, staring through the vent at me while I slept. When I had screamed the night before, the intruder must have realized they were caught, and fled through the outdoor basement exit. We immediately changed all the locks, but the thought of those eyes in the vent still keeps me awake at night. Fast forward to April of 2020. I was living in a duplex. The house was split in two. Each side had 2 bedrooms and a kitchen. There was a connecting door between the 2 sides, but the lock was on the other side. My landlord Jose lived there. He had complete control of the door. I was not comfortable with this, so I installed a security camera in my living room, aiming it right at that door. One afternoon, while sitting in my car, my phone alerted me to motion. I opened the app and saw the connecting door open. Jose walked into my apartment. He stayed for a minute and then left. I raced home, but nothing was touched. That night, I confronted him. Jose claimed he smelled a burning odor and came in to check the stove. It seemed like a reasonable excuse, so I let it go. A few days later, at 3 o'clock in the morning, I was on a late Zoom call. My phone buzzed again with a motion alert. I closed my laptop and stepped into the pitch-black living room. Standing in the corner was Jose. He was holding something in his hand, looking lifeless and staring directly at me. I backed away and told him to stop. Jose did not speak. He started walking toward me like a zombie. I ran to my room, locked the door, and he began pounding violently on the wood with a blunt object, trying the doorknob. I yelled that I was calling the police. Suddenly, the pounding stopped, and I heard the connecting door slam. The police arrived, and we confronted Jose. He broke down, claiming he had a severe sleepwalking disorder caused by new medications. I decided not to press charges, but I barricaded the door with my dresser and moved out shortly after. I still do not believe his sleepwalking story. I believe he wanted to hurt me. Around that same time, my friends and I were going completely stir-crazy from the quarantine. To spice things up, we decided to go explore an old abandoned farmhouse just down the road from where we lived. It was my friends Luke, Kyle, and myself. Luke drove us there. It was only about a 10-minute drive down a winding hilly road. We pulled up to the overgrown, enclosed property where the empty farmhouse sat. Almost everyone in our town knew about this place, and knew that it had been abandoned for many years. Getting inside was incredibly easy. We simply broke a small window on the ground floor and climbed through. The inside of the house was freezing cold and covered in a thick layer of dust. When we turned on our flashlights, we could see dust particles floating everywhere in the beams of light. The most notable things about the house were the complete lack of furniture and the extremely creaky wooden floorboards. Even though we knew the place was abandoned, we still expected to find at least some old belongings left behind, but it seemed like local looters had already cleared the entire house out. We decided to split up to explore different sections of the ground floor. Within a minute, Kyle came tiptoeing back to us, his face pale in the flashlight beam. He whispered that he had heard someone or something moving in one of the other rooms. He pointed toward a dark hallway, refusing to go back over there. Luke and I quietly laughed, thinking he was either being paranoid or just trying to freak us out, but given how dark and silent the old farmhouse was, his claims did give me goosebumps. Luke and I still proceeded quietly toward the room Kyle had pointed at. It was almost impossible not to make a creaking sound on those rotting, terrible floorboards. We discovered that this part of the house contained a small hallway with a two-way staircase. One set of stairs went upward, while the other led down into the basement. But when I approached the basement staircase, my goosebumps returned. I realized that almost all of the stairs had completely collapsed. There was nothing left but a giant dark hole in the floor. As we stood over the edge, we heard a strange sound coming from the basement. It was a rhythmic, slow creaking noise that repeated every couple of seconds. Luke whispered to me, telling me to look down. I took a deep breath, knelt on the dirty floor, and pointed my flashlight down into the darkness. At first, I only saw the concrete basement floor and piles of rotted wood. But then I heard a quiet, raspy voice whisper from the darkness to my right. I quickly jerked my light to the side. There, sitting in a wooden rocking chair, was an old woman with long, messy gray hair. She was staring directly at me with a lifeless, malicious smile. I fell backward, dropped my flashlight, and screamed for my friends to run. We scrambled out of the window and ran to the car, where Kyle was already waiting. Luke hit the gas and we sped away into the night. We never went back there, and we still do not know how that old woman got down there with no stairs, or what she wanted from us. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. Our first story takes us to the vast, open spaces of South Dakota. About 5 years ago, a young man made the decision to move out there. It was the very first time he had ever lived completely on his own, and honestly, it was a change that was long overdue. For years, his parents had been on his case about getting out of the house, finding his own place, and starting his adult life. He finally caved to the pressure. Now, he was not exactly a social butterfly. In fact, he was quite the opposite. The idea of living somewhere deeply secluded and quiet actually appealed to him immensely. The house he ended up finding was located in one of the snowier, more remote parts of the state. It was tucked away on a large stretch of land where the nearest neighbor was a solid, long walk away. That was perfectly fine by him. For the first few years, that is exactly what he got. His life was quiet, peaceful, and entirely uneventful in the best way possible. He kept to himself, went to work, came home, and did not bother anyone. He never even introduced himself to any of his neighbors, partly because he just is not that kind of person, and partly because there was never any compelling reason to do so. The houses out there are so incredibly spread apart that you could easily go weeks without ever seeing another living soul. But then, everything changed on a freezing afternoon in early February. He was at work when the snow first started coming down. At first, it looked like nothing unusual, just a standard winter dusting, but within an hour, the weather escalated into something else entirely. The wind picked up, visibility dropped to almost zero, and the local roads quickly became incredibly dangerous. His boss eventually walked through the office and told everyone to head home immediately before the driving conditions got any worse. The young man drove a lifted truck, so he was not overly worried about making the drive back. He had driven through plenty of bad weather in his life, and his truck had always handled the snow incredibly well. Still, as he drove, there were certain sections of the road that had him a little concerned. The wind was howling, throwing sheets of white across his windshield, making it nearly impossible to see the road markings ahead. By the time he finally pulled into his driveway, he was incredibly relieved to be home. He parked, turned off the engine, grabbed his bags, and walked up to his front porch. But when he went to unlock his front door, he realized something was terribly wrong. The lock was completely frozen solid. He stood there in the freezing cold for a second, just processing what was happening. He tried inserting the key again, trying to force it to turn, but the metal mechanism would not budge. He did not have a lighter on him, or anything else that could generate enough heat to thaw out the lock. He tried breathing on it, cupping his hands around the metal, and even banging on the door handle a few times out of sheer frustration. None of it worked. The lock was a solid block of ice. He walked back to his truck, climbed inside, and sat there, not sure what to do next. The heater was blasting warm air, and he told himself he would just wait out the storm. He figured that maybe it would die down in an hour or two, and then he could figure out a way to get inside. but as he sat there watching through the windshield, the snow only seemed to fall harder and faster. After about 10 minutes, he realized he was making a huge mistake. The longer he waited inside that truck, the worse things were going to get. His truck was already becoming half buried in the rapidly accumulating drifts. Even with the lift on his suspension, he highly doubted he would be able to get back out of the driveway if he waited any longer. Driving away to a hotel was no longer an option. He was completely stuck. He did not have anyone in the area to call. He did not know a single neighbor, and his parents lived hours away. He tried to put the truck in reverse and drive out, but just as he suspected, the tires spun uselessly in the deep snow. His only real option now was to walk to one of the neighboring houses and ask for help. He absolutely hated the idea of this. The thought of showing up on a complete stranger's doorstep in the middle of a blizzard, begging them to take him in, was deeply uncomfortable. But he did not have another choice. Staying in his truck all night was a death sentence. The gas would eventually run out, the engine would die, and then he would be sitting in a freezing metal box in the middle of a historic blizzard. The closest house was still pretty far away, probably about a quarter of a mile or so. He bundled up as best as he could, stepped out of the truck, and began the long trek. The wind was brutal, whipping snow directly into his face. By the time he finally reached the neighboring property, he was shivering uncontrollably, his body numb from the freezing temperatures. The house was a tiny, one-story structure, and even through the heavy blowing snow, he could tell it was in incredibly rough shape. The paint was peeling, and the porch looked weathered and neglected. He walked up to the door and knocked as loud as he possibly could, competing with the sound of the wind. He waited for a good minute, his body shaking from the cold. He was just about to turn away and try the next house, when the front door suddenly swung open. It opened so violently and quickly that he actually took a step back in surprise. The man standing in the doorway looked to be around 50 years old. He had a very nondescript, plain face. He looked at the narrator for a silent second without saying a single word. Then he introduced himself as Joe. The narrator quickly explained his situation, telling him about the frozen lock in his stuck truck. Joe listened, nodding slowly, and then stepped aside to let him inside the house. The narrator should have felt an immediate sense of relief, but something about Joe felt off right from the start. It was hard to pinpoint exactly what it was. The house was warm, which was really the only thing the narrator cared about in that moment. Joe offered him a seat on the living room couch, and Joe sat directly across from him in a worn-out, faded armchair. The narrator tried to make small talk for a few minutes, just trying to be polite. He asked simple questions, but Joe's attention seemed to be somewhere else entirely. Joe would answer the questions, but his eyes kept darting around the room. He would look at the narrator, then down at the floor, then up at the ceiling, and then over his shoulder into the dark hallway. It was like he could not focus on any one thing for more than a few seconds. At first, the narrator thought maybe Joe was just nervous about having a complete stranger in his home. That would have been totally understandable. But the longer they sat there in the quiet house, the more unsettled the narrator became. Joe could not focus on the conversation at all. He would be in the middle of a sentence, and then he would just trail off, staring intently at a blank spot on the wall like he was looking right through it. The silence in the room grew heavy and bizarre. The narrator decided he wanted as little interaction with this man as possible. He told Joe that he was absolutely exhausted and asked if he could just get some sleep. Joe seemed almost relieved by this suggestion. He pointed to the couch and said the narrator could crash there for the night. The narrator asked if they could turn out the light, and Joe reached over and flicked off the lamp without any argument. But Joe did not leave. He just stood there in the dark doorway of the living room for what felt like a full agonizing minute. He did not say anything, and he did not move. He was just a dark shadow standing in the doorframe. The narrator lay on the couch with his eyes half closed, trying his best to look like he was already drifting off to sleep. Eventually, after this long, incredibly uncomfortable pause, Joe finally receded down the hallway toward what the narrator assumed was his bedroom. The narrator really did try to sleep. He was physically exhausted, and the couch was actually more comfortable than he had expected, but he just could not shake the feeling that something was deeply wrong in that house. Every time he closed his eyes and started to drift off, He would suddenly jolt awake, convinced he had heard a sound. About an hour into lying there, he actually did start hearing things. It took him a few seconds to process where the sounds were coming from. He realized that there were faint thumping and scraping sounds coming from directly above him. At first, he tried to rationalize it. He told himself it was just the snow shifting on the roof. That happens all the time during heavy winter storms. But these sounds were different. They sounded rhythmic, almost like something heavy was being dragged, or like footsteps. That did not make any sense, though. The house was a strictly one-story home. There was absolutely no upstairs floor, and there was no second level for anyone to be walking around on. He lay there, his heart hammering in his chest, staring up at the dark ceiling, desperately trying to convince himself there was a rational, normal explanation for the noises. The sounds continued for several minutes, sporadic but persistent. It was a faint scrape, then a dull thump, then silence, and then it would start again. And then, without any warning, there was a loud thump that was considerably louder than all the previous ones. It was so sudden and so forceful that the narrator shot right up on the couch, his adrenaline spiking. And as soon as he sat up, his eyes adjusted to the darkness, and he saw him. Joe was standing in the doorway again. Joe must have been standing there for a while, just watching him sleep in the pitch black, because the narrator had not heard him walk down the hallway. The sight made the narrator's skin feel instantly itchy and cold. He opened his mouth to say something, to ask Joe what was going on, but before he could get a single word out, Joe literally charged at him. Joe leaped over the back of the couch and tackled the narrator to the floor. The next few seconds were pure, terrifying chaos. They rolled around on the carpet in the dark, and the narrator quickly realized that Joe was trying to put him into a chokehold. Joe was incredibly strong, much stronger than he looked, and for a terrifying moment, the narrator thought he was not going to be able to get him off. The narrator kept fighting back, throwing his elbows and struggling to breathe. Joe started yelling. He was screaming at the narrator to stop fighting him, but the things Joe was saying made no sense. He kept referencing this her, talking about her like the narrator was supposed to know exactly who he was talking about. Joe screamed that she was lonely, and he said something about how the narrator would find her to be good company. The narrator was not thinking about who she was, though. He was fighting for his absolute survival. He managed to get enough leverage to plant his feet and shove Joe off of him with all his strength. Joe tumbled backward onto the floor, and the narrator did not hesitate. He scrambled to his feet, grabbed his heavy winter coat off the chair, and ran straight for the front door. He did not even stop to put the coat on. He was too terrified to waste a single second. Behind him, he heard Joe let out a crazy guttural scream. The narrator was pretty sure Joe yelled that she was not going to be happy, or some insane phrase along those lines. The narrator burst out into the freezing blizzard and ran. He did not look back. He ran through the deep snow, gasping for air, until he finally reached the next house down the road. He pounded on the door, and thank goodness, the family who answered were normal, kind people. It was a husband and wife. They took one look at his terrified, freezing state, and immediately pulled him inside without asking any questions. They wrapped him in blankets, and he ended up sleeping on their couch for the rest of the night. The next morning, the storm had finally passed. The narrator woke up to the smell of coffee. The wife, who introduced herself as Kathy, was in the kitchen making breakfast. The three of them sat down at the kitchen table, and the narrator finally told them the entire, terrifying story of what had happened to him the night before. As soon as the narrator described the rundown, one-story house, the husband, whose name was Brandon, interrupted him. Brandon looked at him and asked if the man's name was Joe. The narrator said yes, and Brandon just nodded slowly, looking completely unsurprised. He told the narrator that Joe had been a major problem in the area for years. But then, Brandon shared a detail that made the narrator's skin go completely cold and itchy all over again. He said that about a decade earlier, Joe's wife had suddenly disappeared. There was never an official, deep police investigation because of a lack of evidence, and nothing was ever proven. But almost everyone who lived in the area strongly suspected that Joe had killed her. Her body was never found. The narrator immediately connected the dots in his head. He thought about the thumping and scraping sounds coming from the ceiling, from the small crawl space or attic above the living room. He thought about Joe saying that she was lonely and that the narrator would make good company for her. But for some reason, the narrator kept his mouth shut. To this day, he has no idea why he did not speak up and tell Kathy and Brandon about the noises in the ceiling. He did end up reporting the violent assault to the local police, but as far as he knows, they never did anything to truly investigate the property or search the attic. The scariest part of this entire experience is that the narrator still lives in that very same South Dakota house today, 3 years later. Nothing has happened to him since that horrific night in the blizzard. But he would be lying if he said he does not get a deeply unsettled, weird feeling every single time he drives past Joe's rundown house. The only real silver lining to this entire ordeal is that he became very close friends with Kathy and Brandon, the family who took him in. But whenever he goes over to their house for dinner, he still gets that cold, uneasy feeling, because looking out their window reminds him of Joe, and whatever god-awful, dark secret is still hidden inside that ceiling. And so he managed to survive that night. But the problem was, the horror of that winter was not isolated to South Dakota. The cold has a way of hiding secrets, but sometimes the snow leaves clues that make absolutely no sense at all. And that brings us to our second story, which takes place during another historic winter storm, this time in upstate New York. This incident happened last winter, during one of the absolute worst blizzards the narrator could ever remember. The narrator is 27 years old and lives completely alone in a small, cozy rental house in a quiet area of upstate New York. He works remotely in the finance sector, which he admits sounds a lot fancier than it actually is. In reality, he spends the vast majority of his days sitting at his desk, staring at endless rows of numbers on spreadsheets. Because of his remote work, he rarely has any reason to leave his house during the week. Some weeks, he does not step foot outside his front door at all. For days leading up to the storm, the local news channels had been heavily hyping up this incoming blizzard. They talked about it constantly, warning that it was potentially historic and life-threatening. The weather alerts urged residents to stay off the roads, stock up on food and essentials, and prepare for power outages. So, early that morning, the narrator went to the local grocery store and grabbed enough food to easily last him through the weekend. He returned home and settled in for what he assumed would be a very quiet, boring few days of working from his couch. The snow started falling in the mid-afternoon, and by around 8 in the evening, the storm had intensified to the point where he could barely see past his front porch. He spent most of the night on his couch, half watching a television show and half listening to the intense wind howling outside. The sound of wind during a blizzard is incredibly distinct. It is not like a quick summer storm where the wind gusts and then dies down. This was a constant, deafening roar, making it feel like his entire house was trapped inside a massive wind tunnel. At around 10:30 that night, he suddenly heard a new sound over the howling wind. It was a loud, heavy thud, followed immediately by a slow, dragging sound. It sounded exactly like something incredibly heavy was being slowly pulled across flat wood. He figured that a large tree branch had come down. There were a few old oak trees near his driveway, and with all that snow and wind, it would not be surprising if one of them dropped a limb onto his roof or porch. About 15 minutes later, though, he heard a car horn. It was not a normal honk. It was weak and intermittent, almost like someone had tapped the horn on accident. He went to his front window and looked out. There was a vehicle stopped near the end of his driveway. He could see its headlights cutting through the snow. But that was about it. He stood there for a few minutes waiting to see if anyone would get out, but he could not make out any movement. With the storm the way it was, he could not even tell what kind of car it was. His first thought was that someone had slid off the road. It happens out there, especially in weather like that. It sounds callous, but he was not about to trudge out into a blizzard to check on a stranger. Not when he could barely see 10 feet in front of him. He went back to the couch and tried to focus on something else. At around 11, he heard knocking at his front door. He did not open the door. Instead, he walked over and called out, asking who was there. A man's voice answered. He said his car was stuck and he needed to come inside to warm up and use a phone. His voice sounded strained, like he was out of breath. Part of him felt guilty. If this guy really had been walking through that storm, he probably was freezing. But another part of him still was not fully ready to just open his door to a stranger in the middle of the night. Instead of opening the door fully, he cracked it, making sure to keep the security chain locked. The man on his porch was covered in snow to a laughable extent. It was caked on his jacket, his shoulders, and his hair. He was shorter than the narrator, and he was visibly shivering. He said his phone had died, and that he had been walking for some time trying to find a house with lights on. The narrator was just about to open the door when he noticed his boots. He did not know what made him look down, but he did. And here is the thing. His boots were clean. They were clean and dry, too. If this guy had really been walking through a blizzard for any length of time, his boots should have been caked with snow and ice as well. His own got like that just walking to his car. The narrator felt something cold settle in his stomach that had nothing to do with the weather. He told him again that he would call for help and make sure someone came for him. The man asked to be let in again, more firmly this time. The narrator did not respond. He just closed the door and locked it. He could hear the man say something on the other side, but the narrator was already walking to get his phone. He called 911 and explained the situation. While he was on the line with the operator, he heard footsteps move from his porch to the side of his house toward the back. The operator told him to stay inside and keep all the doors locked. She said police were being dispatched, but warned him that response times might be delayed because of the weather. He moved to a side window and peeked out, not wanting the man to see him. The man was standing near the corner of his house, maybe 15 feet away. He was not moving. He was just standing there looking up at the windows. A few minutes later, he heard banging on his back door. It sounded like someone was trying to break through. The whole door was shaking in its frame. He grabbed a knife from the kitchen and retreated to his bedroom. He locked the door behind him and stood a few feet from the door. The banging stopped after maybe a minute. He did not know how long he stood there. It felt like hours, but was probably closer to 20 minutes. At some point he heard the car horn again, the same one from earlier, but this time it was one long continuous honk. Luckily, the police arrived shortly after that. They found a vehicle partially buried in a snowbank, but it was further down the road than where the narrator had seen the headlights. The engine was cold when they checked it, not warm like it would have been if someone had recently been driving it. Here is the part that still gets him. The officers told him there were no footprints leading from the vehicle to his house. Apparently, the snow was undisturbed between the car and his property. There were footsteps leading down his driveway and around his house, but they started at the driveway like someone had been dropped off or had driven a separate car. The police searched the area, but did not find anyone. The next morning, after the storm had passed and the sun was out, he went outside to look around. To his horror, there were muddy handprints on the exterior of his bedroom window, which definitely had not been there when the police searched the property. It was like the person had come back after they had left, or had been hiding and never left in the first place. A few days later, he found out that another house about half a mile away had been broken into during the storm. The homeowner was not there at the time, so no one was hurt, but the strange part was that nothing was reported stolen. Whoever broke in did not take anything. Why anyone would break into a house during a blizzard and not even steal anything is beyond him. It is almost like whoever did was not trying to rob the place, but do something else entirely. He knew the whole incident did not sound like a movie, but he could not help but feel like whoever was trying to get into his house, probably the same person that broke into the other house, was there to do something sinister. He was just glad he did not open his door. At this point, we have seen how winter storms can bring out the absolute worst in humanity. Whether it is a neighbor with a dark secret or an intruder with unknown, sinister intentions. But the snow can also bring about encounters that cross over into the supernatural. And that brings us to our third and final story, which takes us northwest, deep into the wild and rugged mountains of British Columbia, where a simple mistake in the snow led to an encounter that defies all logical explanation. This final incident happened several years ago now. The narrator of this story has told only maybe 3 people about it in his entire life. He told his wife, his brother, and one close friend who he knew would not immediately think he was losing his mind. He decided to share it here because he still does not have a logical explanation for what occurred. and at this point in his life, he has accepted that he probably never will. The narrator is a 34-year-old man who currently lives in British Columbia. For most of his 20s, he was a highly successful professional skier, focusing primarily on alpine racing. He competed at a national level for about 6 years before his physical body finally started telling him that it was time to step away. It was not a single, dramatic, career-ending injury that forced him out, but rather the slow, painful accumulation of wear and tear that naturally happens when you spend your entire life throwing yourself down massive mountains at high speeds. He made the decision to retire from competitive skiing when he was 26. At the time, it felt like the absolute right call, and looking back, he still stands by it. But as any skier will tell you, retiring from competition does not mean you simply stop skiing. If anything, stepping away from the strict structure of racing finally freed him up to enjoy the kind of skiing he truly loved. He fell in love with backcountry skiing, exploring remote areas far away from the busy commercial resorts and crowded slopes. He shares this background not to brag about his skills, but to make one thing very clear: he was not an amateur. He knew exactly what he was doing out there in the wild. He was fully avalanche trained, certified in wilderness first aid, and intimately familiar with every safety protocol you are supposed to follow when skiing in remote, unpatrolled terrain. Over the years, he had successfully completed dozens of solo backcountry trips without a single issue. The plan for that particular day was simple. He was heading out to a remote mountain range located a few hours north of his home. It was a spot he had skied before, so he was familiar with the terrain. The weather forecast that morning called for very light snowfall, maybe a few inches at most, which was nothing that would disrupt a standard day trip. He checked the avalanche safety conditions the night before, and checked them again first thing in the morning. Everything looked perfectly manageable and safe. He arrived at the base of the mountain just after sunrise, strapped on his heavy gear, and began the long physical process of skinning uphill. But as he climbed higher, the light snowfall began to rapidly pick up. Not only that, but the wind had suddenly shifted. It was coming from a completely different direction than the morning forecast had predicted, and it was blowing much stronger than it should have been. Within a short period, the visibility began to drop at a rate that made him highly uncomfortable. The smart, safe move would have been to turn around immediately and head back to his car. But he was already standing right at the top of a beautiful, untouched line that he had been looking forward to skiing all week. He looked down the slope and made a classic mistake. He told himself he would just take one quick run, and then he would pack up and call it an early day. He has replayed that single decision in his mind 1,000 times since that afternoon. He knows it was incredibly stupid. He knows that highly experienced outdoor enthusiasts die in the backcountry every single year because they make the exact same foolish call he made that day. He knew the risks then, but the temptation of the fresh snow was too strong, and he went anyway. The descent started off perfectly fine. The pitch of the slope was manageable, and he was skiing very conservatively, taking slow, careful turns to minimize any risk. But about 2/3 of the way down the mountain, the absolute worst-case scenario happened. If you have never been caught in a real avalanche, it is almost impossible to fully describe how terrifyingly fast it occurs. 1 second you are in complete control of your movement, and the very next second, you are simply not. It is not like wiping out or catching your ski edge on a rock. The entire snowpack beneath you suddenly turns into a moving liquid, and you have absolutely no choice but to ride it. The narrator got incredibly lucky. The avalanche was relatively small, likely a Class 2. It was strong enough to instantly knock him off his feet and tear his skis away, but fortunately, it was not massive enough to completely bury him. He tumbled violently down the slope for about 30 or 40 yards before his body slammed into something incredibly solid. The deceleration was instant and brutal. He does not even know what he hit. It was likely a cluster of rocks, or perhaps a tree trunk, buried deep beneath the soft snow. But all he could focus on in that agonizing moment was the white-hot pain shooting through his left leg. He lay there in the cold snow, trying to take deep breaths and convince himself that he was okay. But he knew he was not. His ski bindings had released, which was a good thing because it prevented his legs from being twisted backward, but his skis were gone. One of them had tumbled far down the mountain, and he had absolutely no idea where it had ended up. He attempted to stand up, but the moment he put any pressure on his left foot, his leg gave out and he collapsed back into the snow. The pain was completely unimaginable. He managed to drag himself into a sitting position against a snowdrift to assess his rapidly deteriorating situation. The snow was falling heavier by the second. The wind was howling, and he realized he was now caught in the opening moments of a severe blizzard. His leg was completely useless, which meant he could not ski out of the wilderness, even if he somehow managed to find his missing ski. He was miles away from help, and his options were incredibly limited. He basically had three choices. Two of them were essentially suicide, and the third was not much better. His first option was to stay exactly where he was and pray that a search and rescue team would find him. But the problem was, only one person back home knew where he had gone that day, and that person would not even begin to worry or call for help for at least another several hours. By then, he would likely freeze to death. His second option was to dig a snow cave and attempt to wait out the freezing blizzard. But he did not have the proper survival supplies for an overnight stay, and the temperature was dropping rapidly. His third option was to start moving. He would have to painfully and slowly drag himself downhill, trying to cover as much ground as possible before the blizzard completely blocked out all visibility and froze him in place. He chose to move. He did not really have any other choice if he wanted to live. He secured what was left of his gear, gripped his one remaining ski pole to use as a makeshift crutch, and began the agonizing process of limping and dragging himself down the mountain. Every single step sent a sickening jolt of pain through his body, but he forced himself to keep going. His prediction about the weather was entirely correct. The storm grew incredibly intense, and the snow was falling so heavily that he could barely see his own hand in front of his face. He tried his best to block out the screaming pain in his leg, focusing entirely on taking one step after another, wondering if this was the day he was going to die alone on a mountain. And then, through the sound of the wind, he heard something behind him. At first, he thought the extreme stress and adrenaline were finally getting to his head. He genuinely believed he was starting to hallucinate, experiencing the final moments of delirium, before hypothermia took over and he passed out. But he stopped and slowly turned his head to look back up the slope anyway. What he saw through the blinding white sheet of snow made his heart leap. There was another skier, smoothly navigating the deep snow, moving directly downhill toward him. The narrator cannot fully describe the emotion that washed over him in that moment. It was a bizarre mixture of absolute relief and sudden, inexplicable fear. He was highly skeptical of whether the person was even real. He watched in silence as the skier rapidly closed the distance and reached his side within a couple of minutes. The stranger was alone and was fully equipped for backcountry skiing, just like the narrator. He slid to a stop, pulled off his helmet, and readjusted his snow goggles. He looked at the narrator and calmly asked if he was hurt. The narrator quickly explained that he had been caught in a slide and that his leg was badly damaged. Without wasting a single second, the stranger moved in close, grabbed the narrator's arm, and draped it over his shoulder, offering his own body as support. Together, they began to move slowly down the mountain. But as they walked, the narrator felt that same unexplainable, creepy sensation from earlier. It was a feeling that went far beyond the physical pain, the adrenaline, and the relief of being rescued. Something about the interaction felt completely unnatural. It felt as though the stranger had not just stumbled upon him by complete accident, even though that was the only logical explanation. It felt intentional. They made quiet, basic conversation as they struggled through the snow. The narrator was in too much pain to remember most of what was said, but there was one specific comment the stranger made that burned itself into his memory. The stranger looked at him and said, "I hadn't used my legs in a long time, and it was nice to get back on solid ground." The narrator did not really understand what the man meant by that. He simply assumed it was some strange skiing slang or jargon that he was unfamiliar with. He let out a weak, tired laugh, and they kept pushing forward through the deep drifts. At one point, the physical exhaustion and the pain in his leg became too much to bear, and the narrator had to stop. He remembers this exact moment with terrifying clarity. He leaned his back against the trunk of a large evergreen tree, let out a deep sigh, and closed his eyes for literally 4 seconds just to catch his breath. And when he opened his eyes, the stranger was gone. There was absolutely no one there. The narrator looked around in confusion. The area around the tree was relatively open, and unless the man had somehow buried himself in the deep snow within those 4 seconds, there was physically nowhere for him to have gone. The narrator screamed out for him, shouting into the wind, but no one called back. Panicking, he looked down at the fresh snow in the immediate area around the tree, expecting to see the stranger's ski tracks. There was nothing. There were absolutely no ski tracks or footprints in the snow, other than the narrator's own messy, dragged trail. The narrator felt a sudden wave of dizziness hit him, like he had just been hit hard in the stomach. That same eerie, cold feeling from earlier came rushing back with a vengeance. His logical brain tried desperately to find a reasonable explanation. Had he been far more disoriented and concussed than he realized? Had the heavy, falling snow somehow filled in the stranger's tracks while leaving his own untouched? Or had he completely hallucinated the entire rescue from start to finish? Was he actually dying in the snow? He did not have the time to stand there and solve the mystery. The storm was worsening, and he had to keep moving if he wanted to survive. He still does not fully understand how he managed to cover the remaining distance back to his vehicle. The last mile of the trek was a complete blurry nightmare of blinding white, freezing cold, and a stubborn, animalistic refusal to stop moving. But eventually he saw his car. He dragged himself inside, started the engine, and drove himself straight to the nearest hospital. At the hospital, the doctors examined his leg and gave him some incredibly good news. His leg was severely sprained and bruised, but miraculously, it was not broken. They told him he was incredibly lucky to have made it off that mountain alive in those conditions. A few days later, while recovering at home on his couch, he could not stop obsessing over the mysterious skier. He searched online, trying to find any explanation for who the man was, where he had gone, and why there had been no tracks left behind in the snow. While combing through a local backcountry skiing website, he stumbled upon a chilling article. It was a news report about a fatal backcountry skiing accident that had occurred a few weeks prior to his own trip. A male skier had gone missing during a sudden, violent storm in the exact same mountain range. Despite search efforts, authorities had been completely unable to locate his body, and the worst had been assumed. There were no photographs of the missing man included in the online article, and when the narrator searched the man's name, he could not find any social media profiles to see what he looked like. So, he was never able to visually compare the stranger who helped him to the man who had lost his life. But the coincidence is incredibly chilling. The narrator sometimes tries to convince himself that the extreme cold, physical shock and hypothermia simply caused him to experience a vivid hallucination. He tells himself that his brain constructed the helper to give him the mental strength to survive. But in his heart, he knows what he felt. He distinctly remembers the heavy weight of the man's shoulder under his arm. He remembers the physical sensation of being supported and guided down the treacherous slope. He knows there is absolutely no physical way he could have moved that fast through the deep snow on his own, with a severely injured leg. He still goes skiing today, but he has made a strict promise to himself that he will never, under any circumstances, go out into the backcountry alone again, because he still has no idea what, or who, actually helped him off that frozen mountain, and so, we are left to wonder about the mysteries that the winter snow keeps hidden away. Whether it is a dangerous secret hidden in a neighbor's ceiling, a mysterious stranger waiting outside a window with clean boots, or a helpful spirit guiding a lost soul down a freezing mountain peak. The cold has a way of showing us things we can never truly explain. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. When you join the Scouts, you are promised a lifetime of adventure and safety. Parents send their kids into the deep woods believing that the leaders and the group will protect them. But the wilderness is dark, vast, and completely indifferent. It is a place where help is often hours away, and where the trees can hide secrets that should never be uncovered. For some, a simple weekend camping trip turns into a terrifying nightmare that changes them forever. Our first story comes from a young man who spent years in the Scouts, eventually achieving the prestigious rank of Eagle Scout. Over his years, he went on countless campouts. His best friend Justin stayed by his side the entire time. By the 10th grade, both boys were 15 years old. They were highly experienced and felt completely at home in the forest. On this particular trip, they were camping in a park, though the name of the place has faded from his memory over the years. It was supposed to be just another routine weekend in the woods. As soon as the troop arrived at the park, their scoutmaster, Mr. Davis, led them on a hike to their designated campsite. They set up their tents and had a quick snack. As the sun began to set, Mr. Davis led them on another hike. He liked taking the scouts out after dark, believing it taught good directional skills. By the time they turned back toward the camp, the forest was completely dark. Every scout had to use a flashlight just to see the path in front of them. To make things interesting, Mr. Davis played a game to test the younger kids. He pretended that the group was lost and asked one of the younger kids to lead the way back. The young boy stepped forward, scanning the dark trail. But after only a few moments, the boy suddenly froze in his tracks. He turned around, looked at Mr. Davis, and whispered that he heard something. Mr. Davis, thinking it was a small animal, played along and made a dramatic listening motion to entertain the kids. The narrator and Justin laughed out loud, but Mr. Davis quickly shushed them. Just as the laughter died down, a loud, heavy thud echoed through the trees. It was the unmistakable sound of a large creature taking a step in the dry leaves nearby. Instantly, the younger kids panicked, shining their flashlights in every direction. Mr. Davis tried to calm everyone down, telling them to make plenty of noise to keep any potential predators far away. Hearing their leader talk about predators made the narrator feel a cold shiver down his spine. From that point on, Mr. Davis took the lead, guiding the group back toward the camp. But as they walked, several scouts kept hearing the distinct sound of footsteps keeping pace with them from behind. Something was definitely following them. When they finally made it back to the campsite, they cooked up some turkeys, opened up cans of corn, and enjoyed a hearty meal. Afterward, they sat around the campfire. Mr. Davis began to tell his famous stories, and the boys started to relax. But the comfort did not last long. In the middle of a story, the sound of heavy footsteps returned. This time, they were slowly circling the entire campsite, just outside the reach of the firelight. The scouts stopped talking, turning their heads to stare into the woods. Even the adult leaders looked at each other. The assistant scoutmaster, Mr. Roberts, stood up to scare it off. He went to his tent, pulled out his rifle, and stepped back into the clearing. He aimed the gun upward and fired a single loud shot into the night sky. The booming sound echoed through the valley. After that, the footsteps stopped. Soon the scouts went to their tents. The narrator and Justin shared a tent. They kept their voices down and tried to go to sleep quickly. Outside, the only sounds were the crickets and the crackling campfire. The narrator drifted off into a deep sleep, completely exhausted. But in the middle of the night, he was suddenly jarred awake. Justin was urgently nudging him in the shoulder. As the narrator regained consciousness, he immediately heard footsteps right outside their tent fabric. The campfire was still burning low, casting a soft glow. But that glow also acted as a screen, projecting a horrifying shadow silhouette of a person standing outside. The narrator whispered that it was probably a leader going to use the bathroom. But Justin told him to open the zipper and peek. Heart pounding, the narrator slowly reached for the zipper, pulled it down slightly, and peeked out. To his horror, there was a heavy-built man with a burlap sack over his head and a ripped shirt creeping around, holding a massive knife. The narrator zipped the tent back up and told Justin to be silent. With no phones or any way to communicate, they had to lie frozen in fear until they eventually fell asleep. They woke to the wake-up horn and went straight to tell the scoutmasters what they saw. The leaders took it seriously. They ordered everyone to pack up and called their parents to get a ride home within 3 hours. While packing, they found that 2 younger kids had their entire bags containing clothing stolen. When the leaders went to investigate, they were disturbed to find tiny holes carved into the tents to watch them. The wilderness holds dangers of all kinds, and sometimes the threat does not come from a masked stranger, but from the mysterious and unpredictable behavior of the human mind under extreme conditions. Our second story takes us to the rugged terrain of Colorado. The narrator was a 15-year-old scout from Houston, Texas. His troop had flown out to Denver before driving to Camp Alexander. He and 4 other scouts were participating in a high-adventure program filled with climbing and rafting. By the 4th day of the trip, everything had gone perfectly. That afternoon, they set up their tents next to the Arkansas River, preparing for rafting the next day. The narrator always slept poorly in sleeping bags, often waking up covered in sweat. That night was no different. He woke up at 3:45 in the morning, feeling extremely hot. To cool down, he put on a shirt and shorts and stepped out. His tent faced directly toward the flowing river. As he stood in the cool air, he noticed a figure standing perfectly still right in the middle of the river. The freezing water was waist deep, and the figure was completely shirtless. The narrator stared in disbelief. After a moment, he realized it was his friend Dalton. The narrator called Dalton's name twice before he finally moved. Dalton suddenly shuddered, looked around, and yelled in confusion. He ran back to the shore as fast as he could. The narrator rushed over and threw a dry towel and shirt over his shivering friend. He asked Dalton what he was doing in the river at 4 in the morning. Dalton chattered that he had no idea and had just woken up to the narrator yelling. Dalton had never sleepwalked before. If the narrator had not stepped out to cool down at that exact moment, his friend might have died in the freezing river. In the morning, nobody believed them, so they forgot it. For some, a single terrifying experience in the woods is enough to sever their connection to the outdoors forever. Our final story involves a quiet 13-year-old boy. He joined the Boy Scouts but struggled to fit in. It was October of 2008, the final campout of the season, and the autumn air was crisp. During a daytime hike, the boy trailed behind the group. He stepped behind a tree to pee, letting the others get ahead. Suddenly, a heavy thud landed on the ground nearby. It sounded like a heavy boot landing on leaves. Terrified, he ran to catch up with the group and kept the incident to himself. That night, he tried to fall asleep. He had his own tent. Just as he was drifting off, a strange noise broke the silence. It sounded like breathing coming from inside his bag. He searched his bag and pulled out a large, heavy walkie-talkie that he did not own. Before he could even process what he was holding, the speaker on the walkie-talkie crackled to life with a deep, muffled voice. The voice slowly uttered the words, "I am watching you, kid." The boy felt his heart leap into his throat. He pressed the talk button with a trembling finger and asked who was there, hoping it was just a prank. There was no response, only static. Then the voice spoke again, asking if this was Mike. The boy froze. The voice spoke one final time, whispering, "I am right outside your tent." Immediately after those words came through, the thin fabric of his tent wall began to bend inward as if someone was pressing against it. The boy screamed in pure terror. He heard the stalker run off into the deep woods. 2 scoutmasters rushed in and found him hyperventilating. He showed them the walkie-talkie and explained what had just happened. The leaders thought it was a prank, but the boy explained the voice was way too deep to belong to any child. They forced the kids to share tents that night, and the next day they relocated to a nearby campsite with another troop. The boy was so traumatized and embarrassed that he decided to quit the Scouts. He never went camping again, and the identity of the stalker who slipped that walkie-talkie into his bag remains a mystery. These experiences show us that the wilderness is not always the peaceful escape we believe it to be. When we venture far from civilization, we step into a world where we are vulnerable, and where the shadows can hold very real dangers. Whether it is a masked predator, an unexplained river trance, or a stalker with a transmitter, the woods can quickly turn from a place of adventure into a nightmare. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. Cheryl and her husband owned a quiet farm in Buckingham, Iowa, back in August of 2018. It was a slightly rainy night, the kind of night where the sound of the rain hitting the metal roof of the barn usually put you right to sleep. They had spent their entire lives in the farming community, and for them, farm life was really all they had ever known. Of course, living on a farm in Iowa means you have a massive amount of open space, but you also have very few people around you. Their closest neighbors, George and Kenny, lived about half a mile away in opposite directions. They were also farmers, and since there was not much else to do out there in the countryside, It was very easy to become close friends with your neighbors. They often had George and Kenny and their wives over for dinner, and they would do the same in return. On this particular weekend night, they had George and his wife over for a few drinks. They ended up playing board games and got pretty drunk. By the time George and his wife left, it was around 11 o'clock at night. Luckily, it was just a 30-second drive straight down the road for them to get home safely. After their friends left, Cheryl and her husband decided to keep the night going. They poured themselves some wine and put on one of their favorite movies. But as the night went on, they started to get really tired. The wine was definitely starting to kick in. They were most likely just going to fall asleep right there on the couch, cuddled up together under a blanket. But then, there was a knock at the front door. This was incredibly strange. A knock at the door at this hour of the night was something that simply never happened. But along with the knock, they thought they could hear a faint voice saying something on the other side. The husband immediately lowered the volume of the television. They sat there in absolute silence, waiting to see if it would happen again. About 20 seconds later, there was another set of loud knocks. This time they heard a muffled voice say that they needed help. The husband was about to get up and open the physical door when Cheryl suddenly grabbed his arm. He looked over at her, and she had a very concerned look on her face. She shook her head. No, the husband whispered to her that he was just going to go over and ask who it was. Cheryl whispered back that they should not even let whoever was outside know they were home. But the problem was, the lights in the house were on, so whoever was outside almost certainly knew they were inside. The husband walked over to the door and asked, "Who is it?" The voice on the other side of the door said, "Oh, thank God. Can you open up?" "We are lost," the husband asked. "Who is we?" The voice replied, "My wife and I." The husband found this suspicious, so he said, "Can your wife say something?" There was a long silence that lasted for a few seconds. The husband followed this up by asking if they had heard him. The same voice replied, "Yeah, but she is not next to me right now." At this point, some major red flags started going off in the husband's mind. He started to realize that the voice sounded very unnatural. It sounded like a man who was actively trying to make his voice sound a lot higher than it actually was. The husband let out a nervous laugh and asked, "George, is that you?" George was known to be a big goofball, and since he had been drinking earlier, it would not be out of character for him to pull a stupid prank like this. The voice on the other side suddenly changed. In a slightly deeper, more serious tone, the voice said, "Yeah." For a split second, the husband felt a wave of relief, thinking it actually was just his neighbor George, but he hesitated. He did not want to open the door just yet without being absolutely certain. Having someone knock on your door out in the middle of nowhere late at night, claiming to be lost, is just not a normal thing. It is an immediate cause for alarm. So, the husband decided to test him. He said through the door, "Prove it, what is your wife's name?" Suddenly, a completely unfamiliar voice replied, "That is a trick question." The husband's smile instantly disappeared. He realized this was not George at all. He immediately went to get his phone to call the real George. Cheryl was watching all of this unfold and was begging him to just call the police. The husband told her to hold on for a second. He dialed George's number, and the phone rang about 3 times before George answered. The husband immediately asked if George was standing at his front door right now. George sounded confused and said no. Why? The husband told him that there was someone standing on their porch right now, trying to trick them into opening the door. George did not hesitate. He said he would grab his gun and hurry right over. They hung up. Keep in mind, everyone involved was still a bit drunk, which only added to the panic. Suddenly, there were loud knocks at the door again. The husband screamed at the top of his lungs that he had a shotgun and was waiting for them if they did not leave immediately. The voice on the other side replied that they were just trying to use a phone, and that was all they needed. While this was happening, Cheryl was on the phone with 911. But the problem was, out in these rural areas, it takes an incredibly long time for an officer to actually arrive on the scene. As they waited, they suddenly heard the distinct sound of footsteps walking around on their wooden deck. This deck wrapped all the way around the house. There were clearly multiple sets of footsteps. The footsteps suddenly stopped right outside one of their windows. The blinds were closed, but they could hear someone actively trying to lift the window open from the outside. This caused Cheryl to scream in pure panic, telling them to leave them alone. The husband also began to scream, telling them to get the hell out of there or he would shoot. It was only at this point that the husband realized he needed to run upstairs to get his actual shotgun from the closet. Literally a few seconds after he ran up, there was a massive pounding at the front door. But this time, it was actually George's voice yelling for them to open up. The husband ran back down and let George inside. George was holding his own shotgun, looking furious. He said he had not seen anyone or any vehicles as he pulled up to the house. George stayed with them until a police officer finally arrived. The officer did a quick scan of the property with them, but did not find anyone. He advised them to install security cameras on the front and back of the house, which was something they had surprisingly never thought to do before. It still gives them chills to think that the only thing keeping those people out that night was a single wooden door. Now let us fast forward to another incident that took place at a different farm in the summer of 2018. A young man was staying at his grandparents' farm, which was also heavily isolated. He was alone on the property because his grandparents had gone away for a few days. They were actually paying him to watch over the farm and take care of the animals while they were gone. It was his very last night there, and he was sitting in the living room watching television. Everything seemed completely normal until he started to hear a very strange noise coming from the outside. It sounded like it was coming from deep within the massive cornfield that bordered the property. At first he did not think much of it. He figured it was probably just a deer passing through the crops. But then, something highly unusual happened. All of the cows began to moo at the exact same time. Normally you might hear one cow moo here and there, but when every single cow in the pasture starts screaming and mooing at the exact same time, you know something is wrong. Something or someone had to have startled them to cause that kind of panic. Since he was the only person on the farm, it was his responsibility to go out and check on them. He went to the closet to grab his coat, but just as he was about to step outside, he heard a sound that made him freeze. It was a very high-pitched, agonizing cow scream. He stood completely still in the hallway, shaking. He knew that something terrible was happening to the animals. He ran upstairs to his grandfather's bedroom. He knew that his grandfather always kept a few guns hidden under his bed. He found a hunting rifle, loaded it with ammunition, and finally stepped outside into the dark. The cows were still mooing frantically. He made his way to the barn to check the stalls. At first glance, everything looked normal. But as he walked further down the row, he noticed that one of the cows was completely missing from its stall. This made no sense because he was absolutely certain he had tied the cow up securely before going inside. Just then he heard a faint, high-pitched moo coming from the direction of the cornfield. He decided to walk towards the field, but as he approached the edge of the crops, he froze. He could swear he heard the muffled sound of people talking deep inside the corn. He decided he had enough. He aimed his rifle into the sky and fired off 2 warning shots. The loud blasts echoed across the farm, and suddenly everything went dead silent. The cows stopped mooing, and the voices in the field vanished, but the silence did not last. A moment later, he heard the distinct sound of footsteps rustling through the corn. He did not know if he had the courage to actually go into the field, but he knew he could not just run back inside and hide while trespassers were actively destroying his grandparents' property. He walked into the narrow rows of corn, keeping his rifle raised. As he walked deeper, he began to hear multiple pairs of footsteps rustling all around him, keeping pace with him. He was absolutely terrified. He stopped walking and looked down one of the rows. Standing just a few feet away from him was a person dressed entirely in black clothing. The grandson raised his gun and screamed at the figure to get out of his field, warning them that he was ready to shoot. But the person did not move a single inch. The grandson fired another round into the air, hoping the loud noise would scare them off. But the figure still did not move. Instead, the person slowly began to walk towards him, holding their arms out to the sides as if telling him to lower his weapon. The grandson aimed the rifle directly at the person's chest and screamed at them to stay back. And that was when he made a horrifying realization. As his eyes adjusted to the darkness, he saw that he was completely surrounded. There were at least 6 or 7 other people, all dressed in dark clothing, standing silently in the rows of corn around him. and as the main figure got closer, the grandson realized they were all wearing incredibly creepy masks. The man stopped moving, and for a moment, they all just stood there in complete silence. The grandson was experiencing a level of fear he had never felt before. He genuinely believed he was about to be murdered. Suddenly, the masked figures began to chant. It was not in English, and it sounded like some kind of strange rhythmic song. It felt like they were preparing to perform some kind of twisted ritual. Taking advantage of their distraction, the grandson turned and ran as fast as he could through the corn rows. When he finally ran out of breath, he stopped, turned around, and fired about 6 rapid shots back into the corn in their direction. He heard a chaotic scramble of footsteps and rustling crops as the group finally scattered and ran away. He ran back toward the farmhouse, but on his way out of the field, he saw something on the ground that made his stomach turn. Sitting in the middle of a small clearing was a severed cow head, surrounded by a circle of lit candles. He was so sickened by the sight that as soon as he reached the house, he threw up. He grabbed the house phone and called the police, explaining the entire situation to the operator. He then called his parents, who promised to come pick him up immediately. He spent the next hour sitting in his grandfather's room with the rifle, crying and shaking until the police finally arrived. The officer searched the barn and the field, locating the severed cow head and the candles. A full search team was called in, and the farm was declared an active crime scene. The grandson went home with his parents that night. His grandparents eventually returned and immediately installed a high-tech security camera system all over the property. To this day, they still do not know who those people were, but it was clear they were performing some kind of sick ritual. Finally, let us look at the story of a 25-year-old man named Howard, who lived on his family's farm in Arkansas. It was a relatively small family farm, not a massive commercial operation. Howard's parents wanted him to eventually take over the property when they got too old, especially since he was the oldest child and the only son. But the problem was, Howard did not want that life. He did not see himself spending the rest of his days in rural Arkansas, and that feeling became even stronger after what happened to him in July of 2018. His parents had gone away on a romantic vacation for a week, leaving Howard and his 2 younger sisters, Crystal and Morgan, to look after the farm. The property was highly isolated, offering a lot of privacy, which Howard usually found a bit unsettling. One evening, as it was getting close to bedtime, his sister Crystal was in her bedroom, working on some online college courses. Howard and his other sister, Morgan, were hanging out in the living room, watching television. While they were sitting there, the outdoor dogs began barking. Howard went outside and heard a human whistling from deep inside the cornfield. After his sisters warned him not to go in, he fired a warning shot and yelled. Moments later, he saw a man standing near the dogs. Howard screamed, and the intruder fled. He brought the dogs inside and went to bed. Later, he heard whistling outside his window. He looked out and saw the man staring up, still whistling. Howard shot the grass near him, scaring him away. These events show how isolated farms can turn into arenas of terror in an instant, leaving residents with a lingering fear of the dark. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. There is a quick check off the highway not too far away from where I live. It is the only thing open 24/7 in my rural middle-of-nowhere town. It is about a 25-minute drive if I am speeding, which I usually am. So, to translate for all you city folk, it is basically right next door. My sleep schedule is beyond atrocious, so I have been to that quick check more than a handful of times. I like to think I am pretty generic looking and nondescript, meaning I blend in well, but it would not surprise me if some of the late-night workers recognize me by now. This happened just last week, so most of the details are still painfully fresh in my mind. It was past midnight, and I was coding on my laptop. My productivity and focus peaked between the hours of 9 in the evening and 3 in the morning. So I was in that flow state that any hard worker craves. The screen of my laptop was the only light in my room, casting a soft blue glow over my keyboard as I typed line after line of code. The house was completely silent, and the only sound was the occasional tap of my fingers. The problem with late-night grinding is that you go from perfectly comfortable to dying of hunger in a matter of minutes. which is exactly what prompted me to shut things down and grab something to eat around the reasonable hour of 2 in the morning. Just so you have an understanding of everything, I should mention that the highway leading to the Quick Check is more of a local road than an interstate, so it is usually pretty dead. The ride there was relatively uneventful. I pulled into the Quick Check, ordered a sandwich from one of the counters, and roamed the aisles while I waited. The mix of caffeine I am usually stimmed out on and the ADHD I was born with makes it difficult for me to sit still. So, I was just kind of pacing around one of the corners of the store when I noticed something. Facing one of the refrigerators that lined the back of the store was a person sitting crisscross on the ground. It was such an odd sight that I initially overlooked it, then snapped my head back around to make sure I had not imagined it, and I had not. There was literally a person sitting on the ground at the end of the aisle, facing the refrigerator like he was examining it. I could not see anything other than the brown coat and jeans he was wearing. I needed to get a better look at this guy, at his face at least. So I walked a few aisles down. My plan was to turn the corner really quickly, get a good look at him, then turn back up one of the eyes ideally before he noticed me looking. Staring at strangers so explicitly is obviously really rude, so I did not want him to catch me doing it. I was trying to be inconspicuous about it, or at least appear like I was browsing the snacks. But I guess I did not do a good job of that, because as soon as I turned the corner to look at him, he whipped his head around and stared back at me. His movement was so abrupt that I actually froze up for a few seconds, forgetting what I was even doing there in the first place. And let me tell you, one look at this guy confirmed he was far from normal. Forget about the sitting on the ground and staring into the refrigerator. This guy was definitely on something, which I could tell from his abnormally wide eyes and the way his lip was vibrating, like it was quivering, almost as if he were cold, except it was actually hot in there, and he was also wearing a jacket. His posture was all twisted up too, like he was straining instead of sitting, if that makes any sense. But the worst thing by far was the look he was giving me. He was not smiling, and he was not scowling either. He was staring blankly at me with this dead stare that made it kind of seem like he actually was dead. The whole scene was freaky as hell. After staring at each other for an uncomfortable amount of time, I finally averted my eyes and dipped up one of the aisles, eager to get my food and leave. It was not ready yet, though. I stood at the counter and waited. The anxiety was getting to me, so I angled myself to face the corner of the store where the guy had been sitting. I was half expecting him to emerge from one of the aisles, at which point I am not sure what I would have done, but he never did. Eventually, my food was ready. I promptly left the store without another thought. I thought that was the end of it. But as I was turning to get back on the highway, I saw something move out of the corner of my eye. I glanced back towards the store and saw a person running full speed from the store entrance to the far end of the parking lot. I was already halfway onto the highway at that point, but as soon as I saw what looked like a brown coat, I knew it was him. As I drove past the Quick Check, I looked over at it one more time to see that guy was now jumping into a truck. I did not even want to imagine what a guy like that could possibly be rushing to do at 2 in the morning. I was just happy. I had nothing to do with it. I sped off, just wanting to get home in peace. After a few minutes, the last of the fluorescent storefront lights faded into darkness behind me, and I was driving through desolate nothingness once again. I am used to being the only car on the road when it is that late at night, which is why it was so surprising when I noticed headlights in my rearview mirror. But it was even more surprising when I realized the headlights were getting closer, meaning they were going faster than me, and I was not exactly driving the speed limit. My first thought was that I was about to get pulled over, so I instinctively slowed down a bit. The headlights kept approaching, and I knew what was about to happen. Police lights were about to start flashing, and my night was about to be ruined. But once the car finally got close enough, I realized it was not a cop. It was that guy. That guy from the Quick Check. It was the same car from the parking lot. I have never been more certain of anything in my life. I slammed my foot back on the gas and got back up to speed. The guy behind me started flashing his lights at me and honking, and I did not know what to do. Try and outrun him, or pull over and just pray that he would keep going. I was in a sedan and he was driving a pickup truck, so I figured I could outrun him. The faster I went, though, the more terrified I became. I can only describe that feeling as true terror. The feeling that you are literally approaching death. By the time I had gotten up to 100 miles per hour, the voice in my head was screaming that I was going to die if I kept accelerating. I swerved into the right lane, hoping he would shoot by me, but instead he actually swerved to stay behind me. I started slowing down with the intention of pulling over on the shoulder. But the moment I took my foot off the gas, the truck actually rammed into me. I grabbed the wheel to stabilize the car and realized I was in a life or death situation. The guy tailing me was trying to kill me. Everything was happening so fast I could not think. I knew he was going to try ramming me again. And at that speed, I knew I would be lucky not to spin out. I do not know if it was the terror or my survival instincts kicking in. But the moment I saw him go for it, I swerved to the left and slammed on the brakes. The truck shot past me, and I watched as he swerved back and forth a few times, before spinning out and shooting off the highway into the field. Despite how violently my hands were shaking and how terrified I was, I forced myself to start driving again. I sped the entire way home. As soon as I got inside, I called the police and reported the incident, although it is not like I could precisely describe where everything had gone down. They took my statement anyway, and I was happy to give it. I know for a fact that Quick Check had security cameras in their parking lot, so I am pretty confident they will end up catching that guy. It has only been a week since this happened, but I have not heard anything yet. My car is not dinged up too badly, but I still need to get it repaired. As for why in the world that guy had gone after me, your guess is as good as mine. I just hope I never see him again. This happened in the summer of 2022. I was 25 and working what I guess you would call an unusual logistics job. I was hauling refurbished electronics and custom PC parts for this last mile delivery startup that was trying to compete with Amazon in weird rural markets. The routes were long and completely erratic. Sometimes I would be driving for 12 hours straight, often through the night, hitting these remote parts of the Southwest that most delivery companies refuse to touch. The pay was decent enough to make it worth it, and I did not mind the long drive since I had grown up in a road-tripping type family. This particular night, I was deep into the final leg of a Phoenix to Lovington run. It was around 1 in the morning, and I was winding through this desolate stretch of Route 82, past the outskirts of Lincoln National Forest in southern New Mexico. If you have never driven through that area at night, it is hard to describe how isolated it feels. The road is narrow and poorly lit. You might see another car every 20 or 30 minutes if you are lucky. But here is the thing about that particular stretch. It is also the only accessible route cutting through the area for miles. The GPS alternatives would add like 2 hours to the trip, winding you way north through Carrizo or something like that. So if you needed to get from point A to point B in that part of New Mexico, you pretty much have to take Route 82. Anyway, I was listening to some true crime podcast when I rounded this bend and saw a red hatchback awkwardly pulled onto the gravel shoulder with its hazards flashing. I slowed down a bit out of habit. As I got closer, my headlights illuminated a woman standing next to the car. She was holding her phone high in the air like she was trying to catch a signal. My first instinct was to just drive past. I mean, I am not heartless, but I am also not naive about the kinds of situations you can walk into in that part of the state at that time of night. But then I started thinking about my own girlfriend or my sister, and how I would want someone to stop if they were stranded in the middle of nowhere. Plus, I was not completely defenseless. I had a Glock 43 holstered just under my steering column. I never explicitly got permission from the company to arm myself, but given some of the areas we delivered to, it seems like common sense to me. I slowed down and cracked the passenger window a couple inches. The woman, who did not seem much older than me, rushed over immediately and tried my passenger door handle, which was locked. She said she needed a ride to the nearest gas station, and claimed her car had just died, and she could not get anyone on the phone. Her voice had this jittery quality to it, like she was either really stressed or maybe on something. I hesitated for a few seconds. The situation felt a little off, but what tipped the scale was knowing I had a firearm within reach. I figured if things got sketchy, I would be able to handle myself. So I unlocked the door. She got in quickly and gave me this vague and slightly slurred "Thank you so much," without really looking at me. The way she slurred her words made me think she was drunk or maybe a little tipsy, which made me a little cautious. Before driving away, I asked her some obvious questions. Had she hit something, or did the engine cut out, that sort of thing. But she kept deflecting, repeatedly asking me to just drive. Nothing she said really made sense, and I was leaning towards kicking her out of my car the more she talked. I was about to make a decision when I glanced over at her car one more time. To my horror, a man stepped out from behind it, like he had been hiding there the whole time. The adrenaline started to kick and I turned to face forward. There was another figure that had stepped directly in front of the road about 50 feet in front of us. There was something long in his hands, maybe a bat or a pipe. I could not tell exactly. He started moving toward my car, and that is when my survival instinct took over. I floored it. I did not even try to be subtle about it. The woman whipped around to look back and immediately started yelling. Then she reached down and started digging around in her purse for something. I had a feeling I knew what she was looking for. So before things could escalate, I yelled at her to freeze and drew my gun. I did not point it at her, but instead just rested it on the steering wheel so she could see it. Whatever she had been reaching for, she stopped immediately. I told her not to move and she did not. To my surprise, she stopped talking too. She just stared straight ahead with this expression I could not read. Luckily for her, we were less than 30 minutes from Artesia. After a somewhat tense half hour, I pulled into a gas station. There were 2 other vehicles in the lot, both big rigs. I told her to get out. She refused at first and gave me some stupid reason I cannot remember. But I leaned across her, yanked the passenger door open, and basically forced her out of the truck. She stumbled back and fell onto the pavement, all the while yelling something completely incomprehensible. Someone started jogging over, probably one of the truckers, and I could already envision the accusations that were about to fly. All that guy had seen was me throwing a woman out of the car, and I did not want to deal with the situation for a second longer, so I did not. I yelled out a warning to him about her ill intentions, but that was all I was going to do. Then I peeled out of the lot before that guy could approach me and did not look back. I drove to another gas station and started filling my tank. Then I walked over to the passenger side to inspect the seat. Buried between the seat cushions was a burner phone battery and a sealed pack of zip ties. I did not even want to think about it. I tossed all of it in the trash and got back on the road, eager to be done with the journey. I never reported any of it. Not to the police, and definitely not to my company. Not because I did not think it was worth reporting, but because, legally speaking, I did not really want to explain to a bunch of cops why I was driving around armed, or why I had physically removed someone from my car. I am not going to get into it, but you can connect the dots on that one yourself. One thing is for sure though, being armed that night may have very well saved my life. This happened about 3 years ago, when my husband and I were driving cross-country from Utah to Georgia. Although the route we had mapped out was not the most direct, it passed through some places my husband really wanted to visit. The downside of that, though, was that we would be cutting through some pretty desolate stretches of highway. The worst part was this section of western Kansas, along US Route 400, basically 100 miles of nothing but farmland. We had been driving for most of the day, and I had fallen asleep in the passenger seat sometime around sunset. I am one of those people who can sleep anywhere in a moving car, so I was out cold for a few hours. Around 10 at night, I woke up to the car slowing down and realized my husband had pulled into this tiny gas station off the side of the highway. My husband said he was going to grab some snacks and fill up the tank. I figured it might have been my last chance for a while to use a real bathroom, so I got out and headed inside. I did not bother bringing my phone or purse with me. I was just going to be in and out, so I did not really see the need. The cashier was this older guy who did not even look up when I walked in. The bathrooms were tucked down this narrow side hallway toward the back of the store. As I opened the women's restroom door, I almost bumped right into this woman who was coming out of one of the stalls, which would not have been that noteworthy were it not for what she looked like. She had messy, unkempt gray hair that frankly looked kind of disgusting and oddly sticky. She was also wearing these foam flip-flops that made this soft slapping sound when she walked. As if that was not bizarre enough, what stood out the most was this thick purple and green coat she was wrapped in. Let me remind you, we were in Kansas in the middle of summer and it was probably 80 degrees out. She was carrying this tied-up plastic grocery bag, and when she saw me, she just stared. Not like a normal, "Oh, excuse me," kind of look, but this locked-on stare that felt weirdly expectant, like she was waiting for me to say or do something specific. I did not know what I was expected to do, so I just gave her a polite nod and tried to step around her, but she did not exactly rush to let me through. I figured that was the end of it, that she would leave me and I could get on with my life. But no, instead of leaving, the woman actually turned around to follow me and stepped toward the sink area. But she did not turn on the water, or look in the mirror, or do any of the normal things you do at a sink. She just stood there with her arms at her sides like she was. When a young woman named Sarah was 22 years old, she decided to try her luck on a popular dating app. At that point in her life, she was just trying to navigate the early stages of adulthood, working hard and hoping to find someone normal to spend her free time with. That was when she swiped right and matched with a guy named Hunter. At first glance, Hunter seemed perfectly fine. He was polite, good-looking, and seemed to have his life together. Their very first date was just a quick coffee meeting at a local cafe. It lasted less than an hour, which Sarah felt was a perfect screening process to make sure he was actually a normal person. He passed the test easily, and so, they decided to go on a second date. This time, they met up at a nearby bar for some drinks on a Friday night. They both got a nice buzz, the conversation flowed easily, and Sarah left feeling pretty good about the whole thing. It was a nice, normal time, but then came the third date. They went out for dinner at a sit-down restaurant. During the meal, Sarah started to question things. She began to wonder if she really clicked with his personality, or if there was something slightly off about him. He would make strange, aggressive comments, and his energy felt a bit too intense. Still, at the end of the night, Hunter leaned in and kissed her. It was the first and only time they ever kissed. Sarah convinced herself that because she had allowed him to kiss her, things must have gone all right. She decided to ignore her gut feeling and give him another chance. It was not until a couple of weeks later that they went on their fourth and final date. They decided to go out for drinks once again. However, this time Sarah went into the date with a much less excited mindset. She was paying very close attention to the little quirks in his behavior, and she started to realize that some of his mannerisms were kind of unusual. It was hard for her to explain exactly what she meant, but some of his gestures and the way he looked at her gave off highly antisocial and borderline creepy vibes. As the night went on, Hunter started to drink way too much alcohol. He became increasingly intoxicated, and his behavior changed. He started getting really touchy-feely with her at the bar, trying to kiss her multiple times. Sarah was not a fan of public displays of affection at all, especially not when she was sitting at a crowded bar with other customers right next to her. She politely turned down his advances and tried to create some physical space between them. Within a few minutes, she mentioned that she was feeling really tired, heavily implying that they should pack up and leave. Hunter seemed annoyed, but he asked for the check, paid it, and then they grabbed their coats and walked outside. As they were walking to their cars in the chilly night air, Hunter suddenly stopped her. He turned to her and very bluntly asked if they could go home together. Sarah shook her head and said, "Not tonight, I am really tired and I have to work tomorrow morning." In reality, she was lying about having to work, but she just wanted an easy excuse to get away from him. Shockingly, Hunter did not take no for an answer. He kept trying to persuade her, saying things like he would just drag her to work the next day himself. Sarah found this to be completely absurd, whether he was drunk or not. On top of that, she was really unhappy about the fact that he was planning to drive home while clearly heavily intoxicated. She made the firm decision, right then and there, that she would never see this man again. She walked to her car, which was parked in a lot across the street, got in, and started driving home. Because she had consumed a couple of drinks herself earlier in the night, she was driving very slowly and with extreme caution. She was not drunk, but she wanted to be absolutely safe. She was also overly alert of her surroundings, constantly looking around for police cars. Perhaps this heightened state of awareness was the reason she picked up on a very disturbing detail. She noticed that the exact same car had been driving behind her for quite some time. Even after she made at least 3 random turns through different neighborhoods, the headlights remained right behind her. When she reached a certain stoplight, The car pulled up closer and she realized in horror that it looked exactly like Hunter's car. Her heart began to race. She grabbed her phone and texted him, asking if he was following her. Almost instantly, Hunter texted back. He said, "Yes. I just want to make sure you get home okay." Sarah was stunned. She immediately dialed his number to confront him, but he would not pick up. The situation was incredibly weird and, quite frankly, deeply creepy. She pulled her car over to the side of the road and texted him to stop following her, telling him that she was completely fine on her own. She watched her rearview mirror. Hunter's car stopped dead in the middle of the street for a second, presumably so he could read her text message. Then, he accelerated and drove right past her, disappearing into the night. He did not text her back. Sarah drove the rest of the way home in a state of high anxiety, locking all the doors behind her. She did not receive any messages from him until she was safe in her bed. He finally texted, saying, "I hope I did not weird you out tonight. Sorry I got so drunk. Next time we should do something a little more low-key like dinner at my place or something." Sarah was so disgusted by his behavior that she decided not to answer. The next morning she woke up to a follow-up text from him that read, "Oh no, is the vibe dead?" She still decided to wait a bit before responding, wanting to gather her thoughts. But not even 2 hours later, Hunter sent her another message. This time just a single question mark. Realizing that he was not going to stop, she decided she had to reply now before things got any worse. She typed out a message saying, "Hey, I had a great time getting to know you, but I just think our personalities do not click that much. And I also really just want to focus on myself right now. I hope you understand." As soon as she sent that text, the floodgates opened. The angry texts started rolling in, one after another. The worst of these messages said, "No, I do not understand. You strung me along for 4 dates just to tell me that. How about you pay me back half of everything I bought for you?" After that, he sent several more angry, threatening messages that actually contained her personal information. This crossed a major line for Sarah, and it was enough to prompt her to block his number entirely. She genuinely thought that blocking him would be the end of the ordeal. But then, her phone started ringing. She began receiving nonstop phone calls from a blocked number with no caller ID. She chose to ignore every single one of them. Eventually, after hours of trying, the calls finally stopped, and she thought he had gotten the message. The very next day, Sarah got home from work. Her parents, whom she lived with, were not home at the time. As she walked up to the front entrance, her heart sank. There, sitting on the stoop, was a fresh bouquet of flowers. Next to the flowers was a handwritten card. She opened the card and read it. It was an apology from Hunter, begging her for a second chance. But the flowers were not a comfort. They were a terrifying revelation. Hunter somehow knew exactly where she lived, even though she had never given him her address or invited him over. In his twisted mind, he must have thought this gesture would come off as charming and romantic. In reality, it was extremely alarming. Furious and terrified, Sarah unblocked his number just to send one final stern message. She wrote, "Please do not contact me anymore, and never come to my house again, or I will file for a restraining order." She immediately blocked him again, so she would not have to see whatever angry response he would send. For a short while, things went quiet. Sarah began to let her guard down, thinking the threat of legal action had worked, but she could not have been more wrong. Not long after the flower incident, Sarah found herself home alone for the night. Her parents were away, leaving her by herself in their large house. Sarah's bedroom was a loft-style room located at the very highest point of the house. In the middle of the night, she was abruptly awoken by a sound. At first, in her half-asleep state, she was not entirely sure what she had heard, but a deep instinct told her that something was wrong. She sat up in bed, trying her best to listen closely to the dark, silent house. That was when she heard a distinct noise coming from downstairs. It was the very obvious sound of a door opening from outside her bedroom, one of the doors on the upper level of the house. She knew for an absolute fact that nobody was supposed to be home that night. Even through the heavy haze of being freshly awoken, the terrifying realization hit her instantly. There was an intruder in her home. Panicking, Sarah quietly crawled out of her bed and dropped onto the floor. She shimmed her body underneath the bed, pulling herself as far back as she could. She grabbed her phone and quickly dialed 911, while also frantically texting her family members to double-check if anyone had come home unexpected. Nobody replied. As she lay flat on the carpet under her bed, she heard distant rummaging noises coming from another area of the house. It sounded like someone was searching through the other bedrooms. Then she heard the heavy sound of footsteps approaching. Her bedroom door pushed open. The footsteps began to walk up the carpeted stairs that led directly into her loft bedroom. When the intruder reached the top step, there was a sudden, agonizing silence. Because the entire loft room was thickly carpeted, Sarah could no longer hear any potential footsteps. She lay frozen, staring out from under the bed. Suddenly, the silence was broken by the sound of drawers being pulled open. It was the dresser right next to her bed. The intruder was going through her personal belongings. Sarah held her hands tightly over her mouth and nose, trying to mask her heavy, panicked breathing. Her heart was beating so incredibly fast and loud that she was convinced the intruder would hear it. In the darkness, she heard the man whisper under his breath, "God damn it." The moment she heard those words, a chill ran down her spine. The voice sounded incredibly familiar. It sounded exactly like Hunter. Sarah remained absolutely still under the bed, praying with every fiber of her being that her phone would not receive any notifications or make any sounds. She heard more loud rummaging sounds as the intruder went through her entire dresser, throwing things around. Then the mattress above her shifted. She felt the heavy weight of the man sitting down directly on her bed. She opened her eyes and looked through the gap in the bed skirt. There, in the dim light of the bedroom, she could clearly see the outline of 2 shoes resting on the carpet. The intruder was sitting right above her. She had no idea what he was doing, but he sat there in complete silence for over 2 or 3 minutes. Those minutes felt like an eternity to Sarah, who was trapped inches below him. Finally, the man stood up. She heard him whisper, "Fucking bitch," under his breath. He hastily shoved the dresser drawers shut, walked back down the loft stairs, and closed the door behind him. Sarah listened closely as the footsteps faded down the main stairs toward the living room. Still hiding under the bed, Sarah whispered into her phone to the 911 dispatcher, giving them her location and explaining that the intruder was still inside. She stayed huddled in the dark for another 10 to 15 minutes, terrified that he would return. Finally, she heard the faint sound of police sirens approaching, followed by a knock at the front door. She carefully crawled out from her bed and ran downstairs to let the officers in. The tension in the air was thick. After she let the first officer inside, she explained everything that had happened. The officer immediately began a sweep of the house, and soon after, a female officer arrived to assist in the search. They did not find anyone inside, but during their search they discovered a disturbing detail. Every single window on the ground floor of the house was unlocked. In particular, the dining room window was wide open. It was a large window, easily big enough for a grown man to crawl through. Outside that window was a thick bush, and it became clear that the intruder had squeezed through the bushes, forced the window open, and climbed inside. Sarah gave a detailed verbal statement to the officers, received a police report number, and they eventually left. When her parents returned home the next day, they were devastated. They went straight to the police station with Sarah to provide all the evidence they had. When Sarah and her parents walked into the police station the following morning, they were hoping for immediate action. They brought printouts of every single text message, detailed timelines of when the calls occurred, and the exact coordinates of where Hunter had followed her on the night of their last date. But the detectives explained that the legal system has very strict boundaries. Without a fingerprint, a hair sample, or a clear video recording of Hunter's face inside the house, they simply could not file criminal burglary charges against him. It was a frustrating and disheartening realization for Sarah, who knew in her heart exactly who had been standing in her bedroom. She felt let down by the system that was supposed to protect her. The police promised to investigate, but they explained that without solid physical proof or camera footage showing Hunter inside the house, it would be extremely difficult to charge him with the break-in. Sadly, the investigation eventually lost steam due to the lack of evidence. However, Sarah was able to successfully obtain a restraining order against Hunter. She was strongly advised by her lawyers to never contact him again, and to never directly accuse him of the break-in to avoid legal retaliation. Hunter thankfully never contacted her again, but the damage was done. From that terrifying night until the day she finally moved out of her parents' house, Sarah lived in constant fear. She was always uncomfortable, always looking out the windows, terrified that he was lurking in the shadows outside. Even to this day, years later, she still occasionally worries that he might somehow find out where she currently lives. Just as Sarah had to deal with the terrifying reality of an obsessed adult who could not handle rejection, a young girl named Maya found herself dealing with a very similar yet uniquely disturbing situation when she was only in the 6th grade. This entire ordeal began during the week of Halloween. Maya was a happy, ordinary young girl who loved hanging out with her friends. That week, she decided to stay after school to help decorate a haunted house for the upcoming school Halloween carnival. It was a fun activity, and she got to hang out and fool around with her classmates. As a reward for their hard work, the school would provide them with free pizza, which made the whole experience even better. Along with Maya and her close group of friends, there was another boy in her grade who also stayed late to help with the decorations. Maya would refer to him as Chris. Throughout the entire week of working on the haunted house, Maya and Chris got along perfectly fine. He was genuinely a funny, cool kid, and he never once gave her any reason to feel uneasy or uncomfortable around him. They laughed, joked, and worked together without any issues. Fast forward 2 weeks later. Halloween had passed and school life had returned to its normal routine. One afternoon during recess, Maya was suddenly approached by a group of girls in her grade. All of them had wide grins on their faces, giggling and looking incredibly excited. Maya was confused and asked them what was going on. The girls leaned in and told her that she had a secret admirer, and that this boy would be texting her later that night. Maya would be lying if she said she was not excited, or, at the very least, highly curious about this. Like any young girl in the 6th grade, she wanted to know who this mystery boy was. Later that evening, when she was in her room getting ready to go to sleep, her iPad lit up with a notification. At the time, the only communication app she was allowed to use was Facebook Messenger. She mostly used it to stay in touch with her parents whenever she was home alone. She opened the app and saw that she had a new message from Chris. She had completely forgotten that she had added him as a friend on Facebook back around Halloween. The message from Chris was short and direct. It simply read, "Maya, I need to talk to you." Maya felt a sudden wave of concern. She quickly typed back, asking him what was going on and if everything was okay. To this day, she deeply wishes she had never replied to that message. As soon as her text sent, the typing bubbles appeared on her screen. They stayed there, dancing up and down, for a good 2 minutes. This meant that Chris was typing an incredibly long message. To Maya, sitting in her quiet bedroom, those 2 minutes felt like an absolute eternity. Finally, the message came through. What she read was completely unexpected and deeply overwhelming. In a massive, dense paragraph, Chris confessed his deep love for her. He explained that she had been driving him absolutely crazy ever since they worked on the haunted house together on Halloween. He then went on to explain how he had been trying to impress her during recess, trying to show off his soccer skills and flirt with her, but she had never seemed to notice his efforts. Chris wrote that he was growing extremely tired of being ignored by her. The long message ended with the words, "I want you to notice me. So I guess what I am trying to say is, will you be my girlfriend?" Maya cringed at every single word on the screen. She stared at the message for a long time, her mind racing. She felt incredibly uncomfortable. She barely even knew this kid, and they had completely drifted apart after the Halloween decorations were finished. She wanted to let him down as easily as possible, because she did not want to hurt his feelings or cause any unnecessary drama at school. She finally typed out a polite response, telling him that she just did not like him in that way, and that she wanted to just remain friends. She could tell right away that Chris did not take this rejection well. He immediately started typing back, asking her why over and over again. Maya felt trapped, forced to come up with a different excuse each time he questioned her, until he finally stopped responding altogether. The next morning at school turned out to be an absolute nightmare. As soon as Maya walked onto the school grounds, several of Chris' friends started approaching her. They began telling her that Chris wanted to kiss her. They said that Chris had told the entire 6th grade about his plan, and that he had openly bragged that he would do it even if it meant cornering her somewhere on the school property. Maya took this as a direct, physical threat. Feeling scared and helpless, she decided to immediately tell her classroom teacher about what was happening. The teacher took the situation seriously, but did not seem to know how to handle it fully. She told Maya that she should stay inside the classroom during recess and lunch, and that if Chris ever got anywhere near her, she should run straight back to the safety of the room. This solution did not feel like enough for Maya. She was terrified of being cornered. So, she went to the principal's office and reported Chris directly. The principal listened to her story and assured her that he would take action and handle the situation right away. This gave Maya a temporary sense of relief, hoping the nightmare would finally end. It is important to note that Maya lived right across the street from the school. It was a very short walk, and everyone at the school knew exactly where she lived, including Chris. This detail would soon make her situation much worse. Later that week, school let out, and Maya began her usual walk home. She crossed the street, unlocked her front door, and stepped inside. She had not even been inside her house for more than 2 minutes, when she heard a sudden, loud knocking on her front door. Startled, she walked over to the window and peeked outside. She was just in time to see the figure of a young boy ducking down and hiding behind a parked car across the street. It was clearly Chris. He had followed her home from school. Moments later, Maya's mother opened the front door. There was no one on the porch, but lying on the floor was a piece of folded paper. Not surprisingly, it was addressed directly to Maya. Her mother handed it to her, and Maya read the note out loud. The note said that there was a special surprise waiting for her underneath the Cadillac parked in their driveway. At the time, that Cadillac belonged to Maya's older brother. Maya's mother immediately went outside to investigate. She looked under the car, but there was nothing there. However, starting from that exact afternoon, her brother's Cadillac mysteriously stopped working altogether. To this day, Maya has no idea what Chris did to the vehicle, but the damage was so severe and costly that her brother was ultimately forced to sell the car for parts. Unfortunately, the harassment did not stop there. Over the next several days, Maya was constantly badgered by Chris' friends at school. They would surround her, telling her that she needed to give Chris a chance, and that he would treat her right if she just agreed to be his girlfriend. Then, things escalated. One afternoon, as Maya was walking home, she heard a very faint, distinct sound behind her. It was the click of an iPhone camera. She quickly spun around and caught Chris holding his phone up, capturing a photo of her walking away. She was stunned. Who knew how many photos of her he already had saved on his phone? Every single morning, Maya would wake up to a new message from Chris. He would send texts saying things like, "I can't wait to see you at school today," or "I bet you will look beautiful today." The constant stalking and harassment were getting worse by the day, and Maya was beginning to fear for her physical safety, especially now that he knew exactly where she lived and was actively watching her house. Finally, Maya was called down to the school counselor's office. She felt a huge wave of relief, expecting the counselor to tell her that Chris was finally going to face serious consequences, or that the police were being called. Instead, what she heard was deeply disturbing. The female counselor sat her down and began telling her that boys will be boys. She said that young boys do crazy things when they are in love, and that Maya should not be angry or upset about Chris' actions. In fact, the counselor told her that she should feel flattered by his attention, claiming that this kind of situation was bound to happen eventually, and that the only thing Maya could do was accept it and learn from the experience. At the time, being only a young 6th grader, Maya did not fully comprehend how wrong and damaging those words were. She genuinely trusted the adult authority figure and believed her, but looking back on it as an adult, she realizes how insane and dangerous it was for a professional counselor to say that to a young girl who was being actively stalked